So last year I was sitting where you guys are now, and I was listening to the speakers, and I was thinking I would love to be up where they are, talking and being inspirations and changing people's lives, but I don't have any of the life experiences that these women do. And funnily enough, Kathy was speaking to Glenn that week, and she said, Chris and Kirsty, as a couple, they've never really gone through any big things in their marriage. And little did we all know that 2 weeks later that would all change. So these are just a few pictures. I thought I'd use a bit of media because I love my wedding pictures, so I thought I'd show you a few of them. So this is us outside the church. It's us with our bridesmaids and groomsmen. It's just us outside those doors. The beach, and I think that's the last one. I'll leave you on that one, sorry. It's probably a bad one to leave you on. So last year, anyone that was here may remember that I was pregnant at the time. We started trying for a baby in September of 2016, and in the February I was taken to hospital because they thought I had appendicitis. And it turns out it was actually PCOS, which, for those that don't know, you can form cysts on your ovaries, which make it harder for you to get pregnant. So we were still trying for months and months, but to no success. And for Chris's birthday in the May, I decided we go over to London, and we do a few bits up there, and we go to Hillsong. And so we went into Hillsong, and they played the song, Behold, Then Sings My Soul. And I remember we held hands, and we worshipped together, and we prayed for a baby. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional already. And then it really felt God say that actually it would happen. And what we didn't know was actually I was already pregnant at the time. So 12 weeks came, and we announced that I was pregnant. It's the scan. And I remember speaking to Kathy, and I was like, so I'm due on the 14th of January, and that's a Sunday, so I'm going to be on team until the 14th of January. I'll just make sure there's people just in case I go before then, but that's the day, and then I'll have a month off, and then I'll be back. And then the months went on, got to the 1st of September, and we found out we were having a boy. And we started thinking names, but we never had anything specific. We were like, we'll wait till he's out, because we don't want to have a name and he looks completely not like a Kevin or whatever you wanted to call him. And then we get to October the 6th, and I went to work as normal. And then we went to my friend Eddie and Katie's house. They just moved in to have dinner where this photo was taken. This is my friend Ollie. And I'd got to that point in pregnancy where you can rest things on your belly. And that was like the goal. Can you remember that Malteser advert? And they had the little Malteser in the baby belt. That was like the goal of my pregnancy, because I just loved it. And then we went home. I had work the next day, and Chris had work. And it got to midnight, and I woke up and I had pains in my back. And I'm pregnant, I get pains. 3:30 came, and I was getting these surges of pain in my back. And I started to get a bit worried. I went downstairs, just put on some rubbish late-night TV, and just sort of was there for about an hour, then decided I'd go upstairs, get some sleep. I've got work in the morning. I'm sorry if I ruin your mascara at some point. And then it got to 5:30, and I felt a drop-in sensation. And what I'd been trying to push to the back of my head, the fears, were now sort of slapping me in the face. Something was wrong. So I got Chris to call the hospital, and they said to come up to be checked over. We just chucked a couple of cereal bars in my handbag, because hospitals, you're always there forever. And we went up there. And I got there, they'd done the typical sort of blood pressure checks, urine checks, just to see if it's preeclampsia or anything like that. And it wasn't, they were all fine, the nurse wasn't worried. And then she went to do the baby's heartbeat with it. I think it's a Doppler, is that right? Anyone that knows? His heartbeat was fine, but as she was doing it, I got a surge of pain, and she could feel my tummy was tightening. So she called for the doctor, and I'm sure a lot of you have had this, because I've had it a couple of times, that you've got to have a bit of an embarrassing procedure done, and you get a really good-looking doctor come. Because that was the case here, to the point Chris reiterated it and said to me, "He's really good-looking." I was like, "Thanks, Chris." But he was lovely. He explained to me what they were going to do. They were going to take 2 swabs. The first one is your typical smear, and the second one is to test if you're going into early labour, and it can predict up to 2 weeks before you do go into early labour. So he inserted the speculum, and then we just heard the nurse go, and they took it out. They didn't need to do any swabs, because what they could see was that my membrane was bulging, and I was dilated. So I was in labour at 25 weeks. So they moved me to a delivery room where I got a new midwife, came in, and she told me that they were going to try and give me some medication to try and stop the labour, because they wanted me to get to a point where they could stop it enough that they could send me to Brighton, because they have a high-level NICU, which is a neonatal intensive care unit. And yeah, so they wanted to stop it, wanted to put it off, because where I was currently in our hometown, Hastings, they were only a level 1. Brighton was a level 3, so they can only really cater for babies born from 30 weeks. So during this time, I decided to get Chris to call a few people, call my mum, my dad, and I called a few of our friends, just to get them to pray. And then I had another consultant come in to scan the baby. He was absolutely fine, but he was breech. So my surgery started to get quicker and quicker, which I now know were contractions. And I had another consultant come in, and he'd done another check, and he left the room. A few moments later, he came back in, and he sat down on the bed and told me that I was fully dilated, and that for both our survivals, I needed to have an emergency C-section. At that point, me and Chris sort of swapped roles. Beforehand, I was the one crying and getting upset. And then that's when Chris broke down. And I remember at that point, I became numb. And I remember looking at Chris, and this is all the while that these nurses had come in, and they were starting to gown me up. They were starting to put needles in my arm and different medications. They were reading me a waiver. And I looked at Chris and I held his hand. I was like, everything's going to be okay. To the point I was so blasé about it. When they were like, oh, we're just going to put a gown on you. I was like, is it all right if I go to the loo first? Like, I just really need a wee. So to put it all into a bit of a time frame, I spoke to Kathy at 9 o'clock and said that they were trying to put the labour off, even if it's a couple of days, just to get me over to Brighton. And at 9:59, on the 7th of October 2017, my son, Monty Isaiah Gowing, was born, weighing 1 pound 13 ounces. Monty was transferred over to Brighton that day. I couldn't follow until the next evening, because I just had surgery. I remember that night, I lay in bed and I couldn't sleep. And I didn't know if my son had made the journey. And all I could hear was other babies crying in the ward. And I just wanted to hold mine. And at that point, I hadn't even properly seen him. So once we got to Brighton the next day, we went up to see him. And before we even went to his incubator where he was, the consultant came up to us and said that he had grade 3 bleeds on the brain in both front ventricles. And he told us that this could lead to brain damage. It could mean that he doesn't survive, depending on if these grew and got bigger and bigger. So that night, me and Chris went to bed mourning our son's future, because we didn't know if he'd have one or how much of one he could have. But that night we went to bed listening to Behold again, and we held on to that promise that God had given us for a baby, for a son. After a few days, we were told that he had a PDA in his heart, which is a patent ductus arteriosus. I'm sorry for any medical people out there, but that's probably a really bad pronunciation, which basically means that he's got a hole in the heart. It's sending oxygenated blood around his body the wrong way, so it causes saturation levels to drop very quickly. They were going to give him some medication for it, but it didn't work, it didn't shut it. So after I was discharged, we were given a room in the Ronald McDonald House, which is in the hospital grounds, and we were given a room, and you could have a cupboard in the kitchen and a bit of room in the fridge. So we decided to go down to get some food for Monty, and not for Monty, for myself and Chris. And it was the first time I'd really left the hospital. So we'd gone down to Asda, and we were about 10 minutes in when my phone rang. And it was the nurses, and they'd asked us to come back up to the unit as soon as we could. That was the same day that there was that Sahara dust cloud that had come over, and the sky was blood red. And I remember reading on Facebook, people were joking around, going, the world's ending. But to me, in that moment, driving back to the hospital, my world was ending. Once we got there, we were told that they'd done an X-ray on Monty, and they'd found air in his abdomen. And basically, he'd had a stricture in his bowel which had ruptured, and it was leaking stomach acid and milk and anything like that into his abdomen. Monty was dying. So we signed a bit of green paper saying Monty's life was now in the surgeon's hands. We went back to our room and we prayed and we worshipped together. And when we had no words, we just sat in silence, listening to worship, and just on our faces, not necessarily physically, but mentally on our faces for God. Once he was finished in surgery, we rushed back up to see him. This is just a couple of pictures of him when he was born. This was him after his first surgery. He now had a stoma, which he would have for 6 weeks. And then it sort of just life went on. And a few weeks later, it was about 5 weeks later, he had a central line which was feeding artificial nutrients into his body. And that had stopped working and was leaking into his neck. So they had to remove that. And they couldn't put another one in. So they had to surgically put a Hickman line in, which burrows through the pectoral muscle and goes up to the jugular and then joins there and goes straight into the bloodstream. So that was his second surgery, but with that came a really big infection. They thought that they might have to cancel his reversal, his stoma reversal, but luckily enough they didn't, and he went on to have his stoma reversal, which was his third surgery. So after his third surgery, we were now waiting for Monty to have a poo. You'll never know how much I prayed for him to have a poo, and it's such a random thing to pray for, but that was us knowing that his bowel was working. And that poo never came. He had to have some more tests, and it revealed that it hadn't worked properly, the reversal, and there was another tightening. So he had to have another reversal to get him to poo again. This is a different, at first he was ventilated, this is called CPAP, and it's just a less invasive on the lungs form of oxygen. So 3 days before Christmas, Monty went down for his 4th surgery. They'd found that the blood flow just wasn't connecting properly, and that's why there was this new stricture. And less than 24 hours later, he had had a poo by himself. And it was just, to be happy about a poo is a very weird sensation. So we had our first Christmas as a family in hospital. And to be honest, it was the best Christmas we've ever had. Boxing Day came and Chris's family came up. And we just sort of exchanged gifts. It was all fine. And then my dad came up the next day. We saw Monty as we did normally, and we went out for lunch. We went and bought him a few clothes and things. We talked about how healthy he was looking and how much he was sort of looking like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And we dropped my dad off at the station and we went back up to see Monty. And we got in there and he was crying, which wasn't really Monty. He didn't cry. And I picked him up and he stopped crying. And I laid him back down and he started to cry again. So Chris picked him up and he stopped. And we laid him down. Must be nappy. He must need his nappy changed. And when he was swaddled at the time, and we removed one piece of blanket and we saw there was a bit of blood. And so we removed the other bit of blanket and his abdomen was covered in blood. I took back his clothes and his stitches had come open. And through the stitches, there was something sticking out. So we called the doctors and they came over and they debated for a little while of, is it bowel, is it muscle? And that was Monty's 5th surgery, emergency surgery, to put it all back in. And later, when we went back up to see him, it was actually his liver had come out that we had found in his cot. After this day, everything did start to get closer to him coming home. It's a lot of sort of stuff that I've crammed in there. All we really waited for was him to have the Hickman line removed, which would have been his 6th surgery. And he needed to learn to start to eat orally, because he was fed by a tube at this point, and to get his feeds up to full feeds for him to come home. And then once the Hickman line was removed, we were transferred back to Hastings. All this time we were in Brighton. And Chris's job was amazing. They gave him 12 weeks off full pay. So I had company. And then when he went back to work, it was hard. It was hard being by yourself. When he was in the intensive care, he had a one-on-one nurse, so you could chat to them. But then when he got to full term, he was transferred over to the children's hospital where you don't have one-to-one. You're in a room by yourself all day. And it was really hard. So after 126 days in hospital, we were free to take Monty home. He came home without oxygen, which is a miracle in itself. He was supposed to be on oxygen because the things with premature babies, there's the normal things they get. So they do get bleeds in the brain, maybe not to the more dangerous side of it, like grade 3s and grade 4s. They have chronic lung disease, which Monty has. They have PDAs and other things, but his bowel wasn't a typical prem thing. That was just another complication. So he came home with a lot of medicine, but that was fine. We had him home. What I want you guys to take away from today is, even in the hardest of times, God is with you. And I used to be one of those people that didn't believe in miracles. Well, no, I believed in miracles, but they could happen to other people, but not to me. And now I get to look at a miracle every day. Monty, when we later found out at one of his checkups that his life expectancy when he was born, he had a 20%, as being a male, he had a 20% chance of survival at birth because of his bowel complications. The doctor said to us, put it this way, he shouldn't be here. He's brought more people to their knees in prayer than many people would in a lifetime. And to end, I just want to read to you something I wrote after the first month of him being born. And that is, take what life has to throw at you with open arms. Accept it. Wishing things were different isn't going to change anything. Stay positive. Your attitude affects those around you. Think before you speak. Negativity isn't the way. Patience. Even in the worst circumstances, don't take your time for granted. Take those memories, cherish them. Love. Wholeheartedly, so much it hurts. Look in your loved one's eyes. Absorb that feeling. Don't swap it for anger. And faith. Keep it. Don't lose it, because one day it may be all you have to hold on to. And now, I'd like to invite Chris out. This is Monty. Hi. He's doing very well. He's just a bit tiny still. And he's nearly a year old, which is crazy how time flies. But I'm very truly blessed to every day wake up and see a miracle. And yeah, that is where I'll finish. Yay, clap!